They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The last normal thing I did was burn my thumb on a parking garage ticket machine. Wednesday night, 11:14 p.m. The machine at the exit of the Grant Street garage in downtown Pittsburgh spit out a receipt I didn't need. And I grabbed the metal housing instead of the paper because my depth perception goes sideways when I've been awake for 20 hours. The burn was small. A half moon on the pad of my left thumb, the kind of minor injury you'd forget by morning. I didn't forget it. It became my clock, my measure. Every stage of what happened next, I can place by how that burn looked. Red and raised at the garage, blistered on the bridge, weeping clear fluid when I pulled a woman out of the Allegheny. Scabbed over the morning I decided 3 strangers were worth dying for. Scarred smooth and shiny the day I stopped deserving to make that call. My name is Nora Bradeen. I was 34 years old. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru Outback with a cracked windshield and 211,000 miles on it. I was a night shift custodian at PPG Place. The black glass towers downtown, the ones that look like a Gothic cathedral, had an affair with a corporate spreadsheet. I mopped the 41st floor. I emptied the trash on the 42nd. I cleaned 17 executive bathrooms and vacuumed hallways that nobody walked after 6 p.m. For 3 years, I was in that building when nobody else was, learning its sounds the way you learn a roommate's breathing. The hum of the HVAC cycling down at midnight. The specific tick of the east elevator settling after its last scheduled run. The way the glass popped in winter when temperature differentials hit 20 degrees between inside and outside. I knew that building the way a dog knows a yard. Not from blueprints, but from presence. From hours of being the only warm body in 500,000 square feet of empty architecture. I knew which stairwell doors didn't latch. I knew which bathroom had a window that opened when none of them were supposed to. I knew the freight elevator code that maintenance changed every quarter and never told the cleaning staff, except I watched their fingers, and I have a memory for numbers the way some people have a memory for faces. None of that mattered. None of it saved me. What saved me was that I was already leaving when everyone else was arriving. The outbreak didn't start in Pittsburgh. That's important. It started somewhere else. Or maybe several somewhere else's. Because by the time the local news caught up, the story was already too big for a single origin point. What I saw that Wednesday was a man on Liberty Avenue walking with the wrong gait. That's it. That's the whole inciting incident. A man walking wrong. I was pulling out of the garage, thumb throbbing. And he was on the sidewalk maybe 40 feet away, moving toward the intersection at 6th. The streetlights were that sodium orange Pittsburgh uses in the older districts, and they threw his shadow long and broken against the storefronts. His legs moved like they belonged to 2 different people who'd agreed on a direction but not a rhythm, not drunk. I'd seen drunk 1,000 times coming out of those garages. Drunk has a logic to it, a consistent wrongness. This was inconsistent. His left foot planted with precision, while his right dragged a half-beat behind. And his torso stayed rigid. Not stiff like pain, but locked. Like the muscles between his ribs had forgotten they were supposed to help him breathe. I watched him for 4 seconds. Then the light changed, and I drove home. I lived in Millvale, a tight little borough across the Allegheny from the Strip District. My apartment was above a laundromat on Grant Avenue. Not the same Grant as downtown. Pittsburgh loves recycling street names. And it smelled like detergent and the grease from the pierogi shop next door. I had a 12-year-old German Shepherd mix named Dutch, who was mostly deaf and entirely unimpressed by everything I did. He met me at the door, assessed me with the one eye that still tracked well, and returned to his bed in the kitchen without ceremony. I loved that dog the way you love a mirror that tells you the truth. I should have gone to sleep. I had a shift in 18 hours, and my back was already stiffening from the mopping. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of reheated coffee from the morning and opened my laptop and searched for what I'd seen. The term wasn't in the news yet. Not on any outlet I could find at midnight. But the Reddit threads were already 3 days old. I need to tell you what I found and what I did with it, because the decision I made in the next 6 hours is the one that kept me alive. And it wasn't brave. It was the same instinct that made me a janitor instead of anything else. I trusted patterns over people. The threads were scattered across 4 subreddits. Shaky phone footage from Jacksonville, Florida. A doorbell camera clip from Tulsa. A series of photos from a hospital parking lot in Raleigh, where someone had circled figures in the background with red digital ink. Different users, different cities, all describing the same thing. People moving wrong. Not wounded, not seizing. Moving with purpose, but with corrupted coordination, like a signal reaching muscles through damaged wiring. One post, 11 hours old, had been written by someone claiming to be an ER nurse in Memphis. She described patients arriving with low-grade fevers and a specific complaint. They said their teeth hurt. All of them. Teeth aching before anything else. Then the coordination loss. Then silence. Not unconsciousness. Silence. They stopped speaking, stopped responding, but their eyes tracked movement with a focus she called predatory. She said 2 of them had walked out of the ER against medical advice, moving in the same direction, at the same speed, like they'd agreed on a destination without exchanging a word. The post had 4,200 upvotes and a moderator tag that said unverified. I read for 2 hours. Dutch snored in the kitchen. The laundromat below me ran its last cycle and went quiet. I read until my coffee was cold and my burned thumb ached from scrolling. And then I did the thing that split my life into before and after. I called my older sister Val in Morgantown. 2:30 in the morning. She picked up on the 5th ring, and the first thing she said was, "Someone better be dead, Nora." "Nobody's dead. Pack a bag." Silence. Then Val's particular brand of exhausted patience, the kind she'd been perfecting since I was 7 and she was 12, and I told her the neighbor's dog was watching our house with intent. "What are you talking about?" "Something's happening. I don't know what yet. But something is wrong, and I need you to pack a bag, and I need you to take Route 119 north toward Connellsville, and I will meet you at the Sheets in Uniontown at 6 a.m. "Nora, it's 2:30 in the..." "I know what time it is. I'm asking you to trust me the way you trusted me about the ice storm in 2022. That stopped her. The ice storm in 22, I'd called her at 4 in the morning and told her to fill her bathtub and move her insulin to a cooler with ice packs, because the power was going to go out for 9 days. The weather service was predicting 2 days. I'd been watching the radar patterns and the transformer maintenance logs that Duquesne Light published quarterly, and the math said 9. It was 11. Val's insulin survived because of the cooler. Her neighbors didn't. She said, 6 a.m., Uniontown Sheets. I'm bringing the dog. Bring the dog. Val's dog was a 4-year-old coonhound named Birdie, who had better hearing than any electronic perimeter system ever manufactured. I didn't say that. I didn't need to. I hung up and started packing. Not panicking, packing. There's a difference, and the difference is math. I had $3,400 in savings. I had a Subaru with a full tank, 15 gallons, roughly 375 miles of range on highway. I had a first-floor apartment with a door that locked and a landlord who wouldn't notice I was gone for weeks because I paid through auto deposit. I did not have firearms. Pennsylvania's laws would have let me buy one, but I'd never wanted one. That decision, right there, is the one the comments will tear apart. I know, I hear you. But I grew up with a father who kept a loaded .38 in his nightstand and used it to threaten my mother twice before she left him. And the weight of a gun in my hand has never felt like safety to me. It's felt like a fuse. What I had instead was knowledge of a building nobody else was thinking about. 20 miles south of Uniontown, off a fire road that branched from Route 40, there was a decommissioned Pennsylvania Game Commission station. A concrete block structure built in 1974 with a generator shed, a spring-fed cistern, and a chain-link equipment yard. I knew it existed because I'd cleaned it. Before PPG Place, I'd done contract cleaning for state facilities. And the Game Commission station at Jumonville had been on my route for 8 months before they decommissioned it. I still had the key. Not because I'd stolen it, but because nobody had asked for it back. Bureaucratic entropy, the most reliable force in human civilization. I packed in layers, clothes and sleeping bags first, into the big duffel. Then food. 12 cans of soup, a bag of rice, peanut butter, a box of granola bars, Dutch's kibble. Not enough, but enough to start. Then the practical stuff. Flashlights, batteries, duct tape, a box of heavy contractor bags, the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink. I filled every container I owned with water. 2-gallon jugs, a 5-gallon bucket I'd been using as a mop station, 3 Nalgene bottles. Then I stood in my apartment and looked at everything I was leaving and felt nothing. That's the truth. I wish I could tell you I lingered over photographs or ran my hand along the door frame. I didn't. The apartment had never been more than a place to sleep between shifts. The only thing in it that mattered was already standing at the door with his leash in his mouth, because Dutch always knew when the car was getting loaded. I was on the road by 3:15 a.m. The city was quiet in a way that felt ordinary. A few cars on Route 51. The usual orange glow of the mills along the Monongahela. I crossed the Smithfield Street Bridge and looked at the skyline in my rearview mirror and did not know I was seeing it for the last time. You never do. Val was already at the sheets when I pulled in at 5:40. She was sitting on the tailgate of her Tacoma with Bertie beside her, drinking a gas station cappuccino and looking at me with the expression she reserves for when she's decided to believe me, but wants me to know the cost. "Your turn to explain," she said. I showed her my phone, the threads, the videos, the Memphis nurses post. I showed her the CDC's public dashboard, which as of 5 a.m. Wednesday still showed nothing unusual. And then I showed her the gap. The 3-day silence from the Memphis district office that normally published daily communicable disease updates, the canceled press conference in Jacksonville, the FAA ground stop for Raleigh-Durham that had been issued at 1 a.m. and attributed to equipment malfunction. Val is a pharmacy technician. She understands supply chains and dosage schedules and the specific ways institutions lie when they're trying to manage information. She looked at the gap. Not the data, the absence of data. And her face did something I'd only seen once before, during the ice storm, when she opened her freezer and found her insulin warm. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Maybe days, maybe hours." "Where are we going?" I told her about the Game Commission station. She asked the right questions. Water source, structural integrity, distance from population centers, road access. I answered them. She asked one more. "Who else knows about this place?" "Nobody. It's been decommissioned for 6 years. It's not on any prepper forum. It's not on any list. It's a concrete box in the woods that Pennsylvania forgot." She nodded. She finished her cappuccino. She put Bertie in the truck cab and said, "I need insulin from the Rite Aid in Brownsville. It opens at 7. Val, we don't have time to..." "I have 9 days of Lantus in my cooler. If this is what you think it is, 9 days isn't enough. The Rite Aid in Brownsville has a pharmacist who owes me a professional favor. I can get 60 days. I looked at her. She looked at me. Val is 40 years old with gray threading through dark hair she never dyes and forearms ropey from 12 years of lifting stock crates. She has type 1 diabetes diagnosed at 19. Every decision she makes runs through a metabolic filter I will never fully understand. When she said 60 days, she wasn't being greedy. She was defining her survival horizon. "Brownsville," I said. "Then south." We caravanned. 2 vehicles, 2 women, 2 dogs. The morning was overcast and humid. Late August in southwestern Pennsylvania. When the air sits on you like a damp towel and the hollows fill with fog that doesn't burn off until 10. The radio played normal programming. A country station out of Connellsville ran a fertilizer ad, followed by a school bus schedule announcement. The world was still pretending. The Rite Aid opened at 7. Val went in alone. She came out 14 minutes later with a white pharmacy bag and an expression I couldn't read. When she got in the truck, she called me from her cell. The pharmacist asked me why I wanted extra. I told him I was going camping. He said 3 other people have come in this morning asking for bulk prescriptions. All of them said camping. We didn't stop again until the Game Commission station. The fire road off Route 40 was overgrown but passable. The station sat in a clearing at the end of a quarter-mile gravel track, surrounded by second-growth hardwoods, oak and hickory, and the occasional tulip poplar. The building itself was exactly as I remembered. A 1,600 square foot concrete block rectangle with a flat roof, steel frame windows, and a single steel door with a deadbolt that my key still turned. Inside, 2 rooms, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a mechanical closet housing the water pump connected to the cistern. The generator shed held a propane-powered Generac that I prayed still worked. I hit the starter. It coughed, turned over, and caught on the 3rd try. Propane tank read 60%. At conservative usage. Lights only. Pump for water. Charging devices. 60% could last months. We unloaded both vehicles into the main room. Val organized supplies on the concrete floor with pharmacist precision. Food in one corner, medical in another, tools along the wall. I walked the perimeter. The chain-link equipment yard was intact but rusted. The cistern access was clear, the spring feeding it. A seep from the hillside 30 yards upslope was running, which meant the water table hadn't dropped despite the dry summer. By noon, we had a functional shelter. By 2 p.m., the cell towers went down. Not all at once. The signal degraded in stutters. Full bars to 3, then to 1. Then to a gray searching icon that sat in the corner of my phone like a word on the tip of a tongue that would never arrive. Val got one last text from a co-worker in Morgantown before the network collapsed entirely. It said, "They closed the hospitals. Don't come back." We didn't talk much that first night. Val checked her blood sugar, ate a measured portion of rice and canned chicken, and gave Bertie her evening walk around the clearing. Dutch lay on a folded blanket near the door and watched me with that calm, appraising gaze he'd been giving me for 12 years. I checked every window. I tested the deadbolt. I stood in the doorway and listened to the woods, which sounded exactly as woods should sound. Crickets, the intermittent call of a barred owl, wind moving through canopy. Normal, unbearably normal. Thursday passed in work. I reinforced the chain-link yard, weaving branches through the fence to break visual lines from the tree cover. Val inventoried food and calculated daily caloric budgets. She wrote the numbers on the wall with a carpenter's pencil. 2 people at 1,800 calories each met our supplies. Canned goods, rice, peanut butter, granola. Would last 22 days without supplementation. 22 days. We needed to extend that immediately. Friday morning, I found the snare wire in the equipment shed. 16-gauge galvanized steel, a partial spool, maybe 40 feet. I'd learned to set rabbit snares from a YouTube channel 3 years earlier during a period of insomnia-fueled self-improvement that also taught me to identify edible mushrooms and sharpen a knife on a river stone. I set 4 snares along a game trail 50 yards east of the station. Saturday morning, 2 of them held rabbits. I won't describe the cleaning. I'll say that Val, who had dissected exactly nothing since high school biology, held each animal by the hind legs without flinching and said, "Show me once, I'll do the next one." And she did. It was Sunday, day 5, when we heard the first wrong sound. Not from the woods, from the fire road. A vehicle, moving slowly, engine laboring against the uphill grade. Val and I looked at each other across the main room. Dutch lifted his head. Birdie's ears rotated forward like satellite dishes acquiring signal. I picked up the heaviest thing within reach, a 3-pound splitting maul from the equipment shed, and went to the door. The vehicle was a silver Honda Civic with a crumpled front quarter panel and Pennsylvania plates. It came up the gravel track at walking speed and stopped 30 feet from the station. The engine died. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man got out. And I knew immediately he was not infected, because his first act was to put both hands on the roof of the car where I could see them. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I followed the tire tracks from the highway. I've got a kid in the back seat." His name was Dean Cowell, 41, former high school guidance counselor from Connellsville. He had dark circles under his eyes that looked permanent and a way of speaking that was careful, measured. A man accustomed to choosing words for frightened teenagers and applying that same calibration to a woman holding a splitting maul in a doorway. In the back seat, belted in and asleep with her head against a balled-up jacket, was his daughter, Iris. She was 8. She had a book in her lap. Charlotte's Web, the paperback with the orange cover. She didn't wake up when Dean opened the door. "She hasn't slept in 3 days," he said. "I've been driving since Thursday." Here was the first choice, and I'll tell you honestly that I resented it for arriving so early. Val and I had 22 days of food for 2. Dean and Iris made 4. That cut us to 11 days, and the snares weren't reliable enough to close the gap. Dean's car had a quarter tank of gas. Useless for the Civic on that terrain, but potentially valuable siphoned into the generator. He had no weapons, no specialized skills. What he had was a child who needed a roof, and a father who would do whatever we required to provide one. Val stood behind me in the hallway. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I could feel her math running parallel to mine, the same equation, the same answer, the same reluctant conclusion. That saying no to a man holding a sleeping child is the kind of act that costs you something you can't calculate in calories. "You pull your weight," I said. "You do what I ask when I ask it. You don't go anywhere alone. Your daughter eats before the dogs. We eat after the dogs. Those are the terms." He nodded. He didn't argue about the hierarchy. He didn't ask why the dogs ate before us. He just reached into the back seat and lifted Iris against his chest, and her arms went around his neck with the automatic trust of a child who has not yet learned that safety is conditional. Dean earned his place within 48 hours. He couldn't set a snare or swing the maul with any accuracy, but he could organize people. That was his training, reading group dynamics, assigning roles based on capacity rather than desire, diffusing tension before it crystallized into conflict. By Tuesday, he'd established a watch rotation that let all 3 adults sleep 6 hours per night. By Wednesday, he'd built a rain catchment system from contractor bags and the gutter fragments I'd pulled off the equipment shed. By Thursday, he'd gotten Iris to eat a full meal for the first time since they'd left Connellsville by sitting with her and reading Charlotte's Web aloud while she chewed, not looking at the food, not making it a negotiation. I watched him parent that child the way you watch someone perform a skill you never learned. With attention. With envy, I didn't bother to hide from myself. Day 9, a Wednesday. I was checking snares at dawn when Birdie started baying from the station. Not her alert bark, which was sharp and directional, but the deep, sustained voice she used for something she couldn't categorize. I came through the trees at a run and found Val standing at the chain-link gate with a rifle aimed at a man who was standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands at his sides. He was tall, 6'3", maybe 6'4", and thin in a way that suggested weeks of deficit, not genetics. He wore a canvas jacket dark with old rain and mud, and his boots were held together with electrical tape. He did not have his hands up. He did not seem afraid. He seemed like a man who'd been walking for so long that the prospect of being shot registered as merely the next thing that might happen. "Where did you get that?" I asked Val, meaning the rifle. "Dean's trunk. He didn't mention it. I found it Tuesday when I siphoned the gas." I looked at Dean, who was standing in the doorway holding Iris behind him. He met my eyes. "Remington, 783.308. Winchester. My father-in-law's. I didn't mention it because I didn't want it to be the reason you let us stay. That was either honest or calculated, and I still don't know which." The man at the tree line spoke. His voice was hoarse and flattened, the voice of someone who hadn't spoken aloud in days. "My name is Thomas Mello. I was a letter carrier. I've been walking from Clarksburg since last Tuesday. I can see you have a structure and a fence, and I am asking permission to sit down." Clarksburg, West Virginia, 60 miles southeast through mountain terrain, on foot in August with whatever he'd been eating, which based on his frame was approximately nothing. "Are you bitten?" Val asked. "No." "Are you sick?" "I'm hungry. I'm dehydrated. My feet are blistered badly enough that I've been walking on the sides of them for 2 days. But I'm not sick. Not the way you mean." Val looked at me. I looked at her. The math was cruel and immediate. 4 people was already past comfortable. 5 compressed the caloric timeline to single digits. But Thomas Mello had walked 60 miles through country that was no longer safe, on feet he described without self-pity. And he'd stopped at the tree line and announced himself instead of waiting for dark and trying the fence. That sequence of choices told me more about his character than any interview could. 12-hour observation, I said. "You stay in the equipment yard. If you're still yourself tomorrow morning, you come inside." He nodded. He walked to the yard. He sat down on the gravel with his back against the shed wall and closed his eyes. And within 30 seconds, he was asleep. Birdie walked to the fence and pressed her nose through the chain link and whined once, softly, the sound she made when she'd found something wounded in the brush. She stayed by the fence until dark. Tomas was still himself in the morning. He was also, as it turned out, the most practically useful person in the group. A letter carrier walks. That's the job. 12 to 15 miles a day, 6 days a week, in every weather, across terrain that ranges from paved suburban loops to gravel mountain routes, where the mailbox is a quarter mile from the house. Tomas had carried mail in Harrison County, West Virginia, for 14 years. He knew every back road, fire lane, and game path between Clarksburg and the Pennsylvania line. He knew which bridges were wood and which were steel. He knew which creeks ran year-round and which went dry in August. He knew where the old farmsteads were, the ones abandoned in the 90s when the coal jobs disappeared, and which ones still had intact root cellars or spring houses or hand pumps that might function. He drew us a map on the back of a flattened cereal box. Not roads, routes. The difference, he said, was that roads connected population centers and routes connected the spaces between them. Mail goes everywhere, he said. I've walked behind houses that Google Maps thinks are trees. His feet were worse than he'd described. Val cleaned and dressed the blisters. 4 on the right foot, 3 on the left, 2 of them deep enough to expose raw dermis. And Tomas watched her work without flinching, his jaw set in a line that I recognized. Not stoicism, privacy. There are people who experience pain as something that belongs only to them, and sharing it feels like losing a possession. By the end of week 2, we'd developed rhythms. Mornings, Val checked blood sugar, I checked snares, Dean managed the water system and cooked. Tomas scouted a widening radius from the station, returning each day with intelligence. Which roads showed vehicle traffic, which showed foot traffic, which showed nothing. Iris helped Val sort supplies and read Charlotte's Web for what Dean said was the 11th time through. Dutch slept. Birdie patrolled. The infected. And by then, we were using that word. Because the radio, when we could get it on the hand-crank emergency receiver, had started using it, did not arrive all at once. They filtered through the landscape the way water filters through soil, following gravity, finding the lowest path, pooling in depressions. Tomas was the first to observe the pattern. He came back from a scouting loop on day 14 and spread his cereal box map on the floor and tapped 3 points with a finger still swollen from a blister that had migrated to his palm. They follow infrastructure, he said. Power lines, roads, water mains. Anything humans laid in a straight line. They walk along it like it's pulling them. What do they do when they reach the end? They stop, they stand there. Then they turn around and walk back until they find a branch. And they take the branch. Like a search algorithm, Dean said. Like a letter carrier, Tomas said. And the look on his face was the first time I saw fear in him. Not fear of the infected, but fear of recognizing himself in what they'd become. That conversation changed our defense. We stopped worrying about the woods and started worrying about the fire road, because the fire road connected to Route 40, and Route 40 connected to everything. I felled 2 tulip poplars across the gravel track at the quarter-mile point, creating a barrier that wouldn't stop a vehicle but would force anyone on foot to climb or detour. Then I scattered the gravel with leaf litter so the track looked disused from above. We went dark. No generator after sunset. No flashlights near windows. Sound discipline after 8 p.m., which meant Iris reading silently and Birdie wearing a muzzle she tolerated with the dignity of a professional who understood the assignment. Day 17. The cistern pump failed. Not dramatically. It just stopped pushing water. Val heard the change. The absence of the steady hum she'd been falling asleep to for 2 weeks, and woke me at 3 a.m. I went to the mechanical closet in the dark, feeling the walls, and found the pump housing warm to the touch. The motor had seized. Corroded bearing, probably, from 6 years of sitting idle in a concrete box. I didn't have a replacement. I didn't have tools precise enough to rebuild it. What I had was a rope and a bucket, and a cistern access hatch that was 18 inches wide. We switched to manual water retrieval. 40 feet of rope, a 5-gallon bucket, lowered through the hatch and hauled up by hand. 4 people and 2 dogs required a minimum of 5 gallons a day. That was 5 trips. My shoulders started aching by day 19 and didn't stop. Day 23, the fire road brought something worse than infected. Tomas spotted him from the ridge above the station. A man on foot, moving with human coordination, carrying a backpack and a hunting rifle. Coming up the fire road, stepping over the felled tulip poplars without hesitation, eyes on the station. His name was Garrett Vance, and he introduced himself by stopping 50 yards out and calling, "I know there are people in that building because I've been watching your chimney smoke for 2 days from the ridge east of here. And I'm telling you now that I'm not the only one who's noticed." He was maybe 50, solid build, not military but comfortable with the rifle, in a way that said years of hunting, not training. He wore an orange game commission cap, the old style, the one they stopped issuing when the logo changed in 2018. And I understood immediately that he knew this place. Maybe not this specific station, but stations like it. He was from here. The mountains were his context. "What do you want?" I asked from the doorway. "I want you to know that your position is compromised. There's a group, 8, maybe 10 people, camped at the Route 40 overlook. They're not infected. They're organized. They have vehicles. They've been sending scouts east and west. And your chimney smoke puts you on their map. Who are they? People who decided that what belongs to others belongs to them now. I watched them take a family's supplies at the Farmington rest area 3 days ago. The family had a van and 2 children. They left with nothing." He paused. He adjusted his cap. He looked at the station with an appraising eye that wasn't calculating how to take it, but whether it was worth defending. "I'm not joining your group," he said. "I have my own camp. But I'm telling you this because you have a child in there. And I have a memory of being a child. And that memory still means something to me." Then he turned around and walked back down the fire road, stepping over the tulip poplars again, and disappeared into the tree line. Val was already packing when I came inside. She'd heard everything through the window. She didn't look at me. She was folding clothes into tight rolls, pharmacist precise, and her hands were steady, but her breathing was wrong. Too measured, too controlled. The kind of breathing you manage when the alternative is a sound you can't take back. "We have to go," she said. "We've been here 23 days. The snares are producing. The cistern is manual labor, and my blood sugar has been erratic for a week because the physical demand is outpacing my carbohydrate intake. I have 41 days of insulin remaining at current dosage. If we stay and those people find us, we lose everything, including the insulin. If we go, we carry the insulin. I don't care about the walls, Nora. I care about the insulin." She wasn't wrong. She was never wrong about the insulin. It was the fixed point around which her survival rotated, the way a planet rotates around its star, not by choice, but by the physics of what keeps you alive. Dean said, "Where?" And that was the question that cracked everything open. I didn't know where. The game commission station had been my only plan. I'd spent 23 days inside the illusion that finding a defensible structure was the same as having a strategy. And now the illusion was peeling away, and behind it was the same empty arithmetic that had been there since the parking garage. 2 vehicles, 5 people, 2 dogs, 41 days of insulin, and a landscape filling with things that followed straight lines and people who took what they wanted. Tomas unrolled his cereal box map. "There's a place," he said. "I delivered mail to a woman there for 11 years. A hollow off Route 50, south of Grafton. She had 300 acres, a spring house, a barn, and a root cellar dug into sandstone. Her name was Ada Purcell, and she died in 2019. Her family never sold the property. That's 60 miles. 62. Through terrain I know on foot. But not in August, not with an 8-year-old and a diabetic. You'd need to go by road part of the way, and the roads are compromised. We take the road at night, I said. Everyone looked at me. We drive without headlights. I know how to do it. I drove to work at 11 p.m. for 3 years on roads with no streetlights because the bulbs on my Subaru were dying, and I couldn't afford to replace them. You learn to drive by moonlight. You learn to read the road by the color of the surface. Asphalt is lighter than the shoulder. Gravel is lighter than dirt. You go 20 miles an hour, and you watch the edges. That's insane, Dean said. Staying here is a math problem we've already lost. Silence. Iris looked up from Charlotte's Web. She'd stopped reading at some point and had been listening to every word. And her face had the expression of a child who understands the situation better than the adults wish she did. "Daddy," she said, "I think we should go with Nora." We left at 11 p.m. on day 23. 2 vehicles, headlights off. Moon at 3/4 phase, enough to turn the road into a gray ribbon between black walls of timber. I led in the Subaru with Dutch on the passenger seat and Thomas navigating from memory. Val followed in the Tacoma with Dean and Iris and Bertie. We'd stripped the station of everything portable. I left the key on the counter by the cistern hatch because some part of me believed, still believes, that someone else would need that building and that they deserved to walk in through a door that opened for them. The first 10 miles were the fire road to Route 40, then south on 40 through National Road country. Old pike towns, Farmington, Chalk Hill, places that had been quiet before the outbreak and were quieter now in ways that made quiet feel like a held breath. Tomas directed me off 40 at Addison and onto a county road that wound through dairy country. The cows were gone. The barns were dark. Once, in the Subaru's side mirror, I saw a figure standing in a field at a distance I couldn't estimate, motionless, oriented toward us. We kept driving. Speed was agonizing. 20 miles per hour felt reckless in the dark. 15 felt safe, but burned time we didn't have. I watched the road surface the way I used to watch the 41st floor, reading textures, anticipating transitions, trusting my body's knowledge of surfaces more than my eyes. The asphalt told me things through the steering wheel. A patch of gravel where a culvert had washed out. A soft spot where subsurface water was undermining the roadbed, or the particular vibration of a bridge deck versus solid ground. My hands knew every message. My burned thumb, still tender, registered each one. At mile 31, we hit the blockade. 2 pickup trucks parked nose to nose across the road, a chain strung between them at bumper height. Behind them, a fire burning in a barrel, and 4 silhouettes visible against the light. I stopped the Subaru 70 yards out. Val stopped behind me. I could see the figures moving, one of them reaching into a truck bed. "Turn around," Tomas said. "There's no turnaround. The shoulder drops off. There's a field access 30 yards back on the left. I delivered mail to the farm it belongs to. The lane runs parallel to this road for a 1/4 mile and reconnects past the next bend." I put the Subaru in reverse. No brake lights. I'd pulled the fuse before we left, both vehicles. We backed up in darkness, found the field access, and turned onto a dirt lane so narrow that corn stubble scraped both doors. The lane curved through a stand of walnut trees and emerged onto the road again. 200 yards past the blockade. We didn't stop until dawn. The hollow was real. Tomas led us off Route 50 onto a gravel track that descended through rhododendron, so dense the canopy closed above us like a tunnel. The track crossed a creek on a concrete ford. Water over the concrete, maybe 4 inches deep, clear and fast, and climbed the far bank to a flat bench of land tucked against a sandstone ridge. Ada Purcell's property looked like a woman who'd been dead for 7 years and whose land had been mourning her since. The farmhouse was half collapsed, roof caved in the kitchen wing. But the barn stood. The spring house stood. And the root cellar, dug into the base of the sandstone ridge, with a door made of oak planks and a hand-forged iron latch, opened into a space cool and dry and exactly the size of a room, where 5 people and 2 dogs could sleep without touching the walls. We had arrived. I want to tell you that arrival felt like relief. It didn't. It felt like a new math problem with the same variables and a different shape. Val had 39 days of insulin. We had food for 10 days, maybe 12 with rationing. The spring house produced clean water. The barn could be secured. But the hollow was not a fortress. It was a low place, and I'd spent 23 days learning that low places gathered things. Dean and Tomas secured the barn. Val organized the root cellar into a medical station and a sleeping area, dividing the space with a hanging tarp with a precision that revealed she'd been thinking about this configuration for days. Iris explored the creek and came back with a crayfish in each hand and a smile that made every mile of the night drive worth its cost. I climbed the ridge. From the top, I could see the hollow spread below me. The barn, the spring house, the ruined farmhouse, the creek bending through bottomland thick with ironweed and Joe Pye weed. Beyond the hollow, the mountains folded into each other, ridge after ridge, trending northeast toward the Alleghenies. No smoke, no movement, no sound except wind and the distant complaint of a raven who objected to my presence. But south, maybe 3 miles away, I could see Route 50. And on Route 50, I could see vehicles, not moving, parked, a line of them stretching east like a blood clot in an artery. Day 29. Tomas set snares. Dean repaired the barn's sliding door. Val rationed food with the exactitude of someone dosing a controlled substance. I established a watch from the ridge, 4 hours each, rotating. Day 32. Dean and I had the argument that had been building since the fire road. It started with the rifle. Val had been keeping it in the root cellar, unloaded, with the ammunition in a separate container. Dean wanted it loaded and accessible at the barn entrance. I wanted it where Val had it. Dean said my fear of firearms was a personal problem that endangered his daughter. I said his failure to disclose the rifle when he arrived was a pattern of withholding that endangered all of us. We stood in the barn, 6 feet apart, and said things that were true and unkind and necessary. Iris was in the root cellar with Val. Thomas was on ridge watch. It was just us and Dutch, who lay in a patch of sun near the door and offered no opinion. "You don't trust me," Dean said. "I trust you with Iris. I trust you with the water system. I don't trust you with the one weapon we have. Because you hid it. I hid it because I thought you'd turn us away if you saw it. I might have. Then I was right to hide it. That stopped me. Not because it was a good argument, but because it was an honest one. He'd made a calculation. Concealment in exchange for entry. And the calculation had worked. His daughter had slept under a roof for 23 nights because he'd tucked a .308 under a spare tire and kept his mouth shut. Was that deception, or was that fatherhood? I didn't resolve it. I said, "Loaded, in the barn. But Val controls the ammunition count, and you account for every round." He agreed. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need to. The agreement wasn't built on restored trust. It was built on the shared understanding that the alternative, fracture, would kill us faster than anything outside the fence. Day 44. The morning the radio signal came through, Val was adjusting the hand crank receiver, scanning frequencies the way she did every third morning. An act of discipline I'd initially dismissed as optimism and had come to recognize as labor, the work of refusing to let silence be the final answer. She caught it at 162.475 megahertz, a NOAA weather frequency repurposed for emergency broadcasting. A woman's voice, steady and uninfected in its cadence, reading a script that had been written by someone who understood that the people listening had been alone for a long time. Federal Emergency Coordination Point active at Tigert Lake State Park. Receiving civilians, medical resources available. Coordinates follow. This message repeats every 15 minutes. If you can hear this, you are not alone. Val's hands stopped moving. She held the radio the way you hold a newborn, with a grip calibrated between firm enough to protect and gentle enough not to harm. The message repeated. The woman's voice said the same words, and they sounded different the second time, the way a door looks different when you realize it's unlocked. Tigert Lake was 19 miles northeast, through mountain terrain, but Thomas knew the routes. One day's travel on foot, maybe less by vehicle if the roads were clear. Here was the last dilemma, and the one that cost me most. We had supplies for 11 more days. Val had 18 days of insulin. The hollow was defensible, productive, and so far undetected. The radio signal was unverified. We had no way to confirm it was real, that the coordination point was operational, that medical resources meant an insulin, that receiving civilians didn't mean something worse than what we'd seen at the blockade on mile 31. Tomas said go. Dean said go. Val said nothing. She held the radio and looked at the wall where she'd written the numbers. Insulin remaining, calories per day, water output, snare yield. And I watched her calculate a future in which we stayed and one in which we left. And I understood that both futures ended at the same number. 18 days. That was her horizon. Everything beyond it was someone else's math. I'll go alone first, I said. I'll verify. I'll come back. No, Val, finally speaking. We go together or not at all. I'm not sitting in a root cellar waiting for you to come back. I've been the one who waits my entire life. I waited for Mom to leave Dad. I waited for the diagnosis to make sense. I waited for you to call me about every emergency you ever predicted. I'm done waiting. We go together. We went together. The morning was cool. Early October, the first breath of autumn, turning the hardwoods on the ridgeline, red maple and sugar maple igniting against the dark green of a hemlock and pine. Birdie walked point, 30 yards ahead, her nose doing the work our eyes couldn't. Tomas navigated. Dean carried Iris on his back when her legs gave out at mile 6. Val walked with the insulin cooler in her pack and her shoulders squared against a weight that was physical and chemical and temporal all at once. Dutch walked beside me, slow, his hips grinding in a way that told me the dysplasia that had been building for years was reaching its conclusion. He kept pace. He did not complain. He had never complained about anything except the absence of dinner. And even that he communicated through silence rather than sound, as a fixed stare at the bowl, a single glance at me, the patience of a creature who trusted that the system would provide, because the system always had. We reached Tigert Lake at 4 p.m. The coordination point was real. It was a cluster of military tents and civilian RVs arranged around the park's boat launch. And when we walked out of the tree line, a woman in a National Guard uniform lowered her rifle and said, "How many in your group?" 5. 2 dogs. Medical needs. Type 1 diabetic, 41-year-old female, 18 days of Lantus remaining. The guardswoman spoke into a radio. Within 5 minutes, a medic was walking toward us with a cooler marked with the Red Cross that means the same thing in every language. Val watched him approach. She did not move. I think she was afraid that if she stepped forward, the image would dissolve, the way a reflection breaks when you reach into the water. The medic opened the cooler. Inside, Lantus pens, Humalog pens, glucose tabs, alcohol swabs, a logbook. Val sat down on the ground. Not collapsed, sat. The way a person sits when a weight they've been carrying is not removed, but shared, redistributed across enough shoulders that the individual burden becomes survivable. Birdie lay down beside her and put her head in Val's lap. Iris sat on Val's other side and opened Charlotte's Web to a random page and began reading aloud. And her voice carried across the boat launch. A child reading a story about a spider who saved a pig through the power of writing words. And nobody stopped her. And nobody told her it wasn't the time, because it was exactly the time. It was the only time that mattered. I stood at the edge of the water. Tigert Lake was flat and still and reflected the mountains and the sky with an accuracy that made the reflection indistinguishable from the source. Dutch leaned against my leg. His weight was warm and familiar and finite in a way I could feel in the thinning muscle along his spine. I looked at my left thumb. The burn was a scar now. Smooth, pale, smaller than a dime. It didn't hurt. It hadn't hurt in weeks. But I could still feel the parking garage ticket machine, the moment of contact, the small bright pain that was the last ordinary sensation of my former life. I'd cleaned buildings for a living, emptied other people's trash, mopped floors nobody would see until morning. I'd been invisible, and my invisibility had taught me to watch. And watching had taught me to read the silences between events. And reading those silences had kept 5 people and 2 dogs alive for 44 days across 60 miles of broken country. That was enough. That was the whole thing. Not heroism, not strategy. Just a woman who knew how to pay attention in the dark, who trusted her sister enough to call at 2:30 in the morning, and who drove without headlights because she'd been practicing for years without knowing why. I wrote this story because I wanted to explore something the survival genre doesn't talk about enough: the people who already live on the margins. Nora isn't a former Special Forces operator. She isn't a wealthy prepper. She's a night shift custodian with a scarred thumb and a 12-year-old dog, and the kind of situational awareness that comes from being the only person awake in a building for 3 years straight. Her survival isn't aspirational. It's a continuation of what she was already doing: watching, reading environments, staying invisible, and doing the work nobody notices until it stops getting done. The insulin thread was important to me. Val's diabetes isn't a dramatic device. It's a countdown that real people live with every day, and it shapes every decision differently than an able-bodied survival fantasy suggests. I wanted the story's final emotional turn to hinge not on a gunfight or a last stand, but on a cooler full of insulin pens. Because for millions of people, that is what survival actually looks like. 3 questions I'd like to leave with you. First, the practical one. Nora chose not to acquire a firearm despite having the legal ability and the financial means. Given the threat environment, was that decision defensible, or did her personal history compromise the group's safety? Second, the moral one. Dean concealed the rifle to avoid being turned away. If the deception worked, if it kept Iris under a roof for 23 nights, does the outcome justify the method? Third, the personal one. Nora describes herself as invisible. A person whose work only becomes visible when it stops being done. Have you ever been the person holding something together that nobody noticed until it broke? What did it cost you? Thank you for listening. 3 hours of your attention is not nothing. It's the most generous thing you can offer a stranger with a story, and I don't take a minute of it for granted.